All right, welcome back, everybody. And we will start the afternoon session of COMSTAC. Charity, over to you.
Thank you, Jim. I hope everyone got the chance to get some lunch, refresh, and get ready for the afternoon session here. First up, we have the Regulatory Working Group, which is led by Shanna Dale and Clay Morey. And I will hand it over to you, Shanna, and look to the slides to be brought up. Thank you.
Yes, so I'm going to go ahead and get started as the slides are coming up. I'm going to just briefly introduce the first task, which was part 440, brilliant white paper developed by Ann Ziolkowski and Jared Stout, as per usual. Obviously, very complex financial issues that we're dealing with in 440. As I mentioned earlier today, we got some really great input, including demystifying and documenting the current NPL process, as well as other really good recommendations. So I'm going to turn it over to Ann because she led this effort, and she can go into some of the draft recommendations that were made. But I would also encourage those who sent in some comments, let's go ahead and have that discussion here, because I think those were really solid recommendations. I also feel like it may trigger thought process for others in regards to elements that we need to be thinking of. So I'm going to turn it over to Ann first, and then we're going to turn over to Clay Morey, my co-chair, to discuss task 2 and introduce Mike French. With that, I would like to turn it over to Ann Ziolkowski. Thank you.
Thanks, Shanna. I appreciate that. So as Shanna mentioned, we're just on the kind of the front end of this and have gotten some good inputs, but I think there's a lot of ground we can cover between now and the next meeting in the spring. So just a little bit of background. So in light of the continued growth and the evolution of the commercial space industry, and we've certainly heard a lot about all of that so far today, the FAA has asked for COMSTAC's help in providing recommendations to improve the maximum probable loss threshold, currently set at 1 in 10 million for third parties and 1 in 100,000 for government property. The FAA also asked COMSTAC to provide recommendations on improving the cost of a casualty calculation for input into the MPL. Just by way of background, again, the US government shares liability risk with industry for losses from damages to third parties or federal property. The FAA determines the MPL thresholds, but those were originally established about 25 years ago. No doubt we can all agree that much has changed in the ensuing 25 years in the commercial space industry. And there has also been considerable debate over the years about the 1 in 10 million threshold, and in particular, if that's the right balance of risk between the launch providers and the federal government, or if it should be some other threshold. Additionally, the FAA has also been advised by GAO to update its cost of casualty estimates. So with that as a lead-in, COMSTAC's on the front end of developing recommendations for both improving the MPL and improving the cost of a casualty calculation for input into the MPL. Again, we'll be collecting detail. As Shanna has mentioned, we've already gotten some of those inputs, but the possible recommendations could include an external analysis of the appropriateness of the 1 in 10 million threshold and potentially a future formal rulemaking on MPL thresholds. The cost of a casualty is even more difficult, and COMSTAC's inputs might center more around factors that the FAA must include in determining such a cost and provide potential alternative formulations for developing MPL risk criteria associated with injury or death. So that's just a quick update on what we've been working on, the draft we put together, and the work to come. And look forward to more dialogue as we move towards the next meeting. And with that, I'll open it up or turn things back to Shanna.
And just wanted to say quickly, if anybody wants to get into some of the recommendations, like Steve, for example, you had great input. And if not, we can move on. But let us know if you want to make a few comments.
Yeah, Shanna, this is Steve. I can make a couple of comments. The inputs that we provided on this one really had to do with how the MPL calculation is done. As you know, we're kind of in the middle of this right now because we're getting ready to fly Dream Chaser next year, into next year. And so it's an important, how you do it is important to us. We struggle right now to understand exactly how it's done because we don't have insight into how the calculation is performed. And what we really like to have is our own in-house capabilities so that before we go into licensing, we know that things are looking good with our trajectory choices and things like that. And so that's most of my comments really surrounded how the MPL is calculated and also the assumptions behind that. And then finally, having independent analysis of that or independent capabilities from multiple companies, not just one tool. So I won't go through any in further detail now, but those are the main things that we provided as input.
And Steve, I just want to say, I thought that was really solid input. And I think you probably are speaking for a lot of firms that are out there. So we appreciate that. And we want to continue the discussion.
Yeah, sure. Happy to do it. And I'm sure, anybody that's in the heat of actually getting ready to do this like we are, would probably have the similar concerns to us, I'm sure.
Yeah, Shannon, I echo his comments as well. I think that those are appropriate.
And same here for me. As we've gone through this too, and having better transparency there would be super helpful.
With that, I think we're going to, unless there are any other comments, I think we're going to move over to Clay now and some of his discussion of his item, and then also task 2. Thanks, Clay. And thanks, Ann.
Yeah, thanks, Shannon. I was just going to say thank you, Ann and Jared, for all the work that they've put in on that so far. And we've obviously got a little bit ways to go. It's fairly complex, but we want to make sure we get it right and get more input. Task 2 is representation on the aerospace rulemaking committees. So trying to figure out, then there's 2 areas to that: the human spaceflight regulatory reform and the launch and reentry financial responsibility and insurance reform. So I'd like to thank Mike French for taking on this task and trying to put together a draft set of folks for these 2 segments: the human spaceflight regulatory reform and the launch and reentry financial responsibility. So we have lists. We're soliciting other folks to join this. But Mike's done a nice job putting together a broad list of, particularly from the companies and the stakeholders that are involved in, I think, human spaceflight work right now, with either on the capsule side, launch side, or other, and both suborbital and orbital, and then on the launch and reentry as well. Also including companies that are involved from the insurance side. So we're trying to get representation from the broker and underwriter community to make sure they're involved as well. So we've got that list right now. If there are others that are interested in joining on there, and is Mike, if you're on the call, I don't know if you wanted to make any comment there as well. So just I'll go straight to the recommendation. The charts lay out the discussion so far, and we have an initial list. Mike says he can't speak, no comment from him. So we have this initial list that's on there. Here we go. Yeah, you can see the organizations that are represented, and we're absolutely happy to add others on there as if there are participants on this call that want to be involved. We're happy to include.
And there's also a second page if we,
exactly.
Thank you.
So that's the initial list of recommended organizations. And so if there's further recommendations there, please let us know. I think that's all there on that point. And then I think there was also, Shanna, we were talking about a little bit of a discussion of the alternatives to insurance.
Yes.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things at work here. I think outside of the traditional aspects of procuring insurance from the the broker and underwriter community that exists at large, that has served the industry quite well over the past decades. A couple of those things that we've been investigating. One is the creation of captive insurance arms. So there have been companies in the launch business that have looked to create captive insurance companies to provide insurance for missions. The other is one where you have alternatives where you can do a parent guarantee. And so, in fact, if you look at my company, Blue Origin, and our licensing right now, we're offering for our new Shepherd launch is a parent guarantee, which is a set aside of funds when we fly that would cover if there was in the event of a mishap. So those things exist right now. We want to have a further discussion about other alternatives that could be out there.
Mr. Murray, I just need the pin for the upgrade.
Sorry. And so happy to engage as well on that. If there are other folks that want to join that discussion within those two areas, but those are the two things we've identified as a group. And we also understand that I think for a lot of the companies, particularly the newer entrants into this segment of the market, that those two things might not be possible, right? They are for more or less experienced companies that are well capitalized and have the ability to do that. Those two options may not be, and we don't think would be the only options that are out there right now, but they are ones that actually are up and operating and functional right now with respect to alternatives for individual operator insurance. So Shannon, don't know if there's anything more to discuss on that topic, but I invite the COMSTAC for comment.
So Clay, it's Mike Moses, just the voice of support for that, right? I think a good summary and good attack, and I like what you said too. You get a little different perspective having gone through it, and you can easily see where you could have really found some better ways through it the next time. So I think you're right on track with these recommendations.
Thanks, Mike. Okay.
So, Clay, do you want to do the motion?
Sure. I think motion on this representation is to propose the list we have now and ask for further if people want to join the list for these ARCs. Happy to take that on.
I second the motion.
Thank you, Shanna. We'll do a roll call vote. I think for the FAA folks that are controlling the presentation, there may be some COMSTAC members that are unable to unmute themselves. So if I call on folks and they're unable to respond, please put something in the chat just so we can capture your vote. And then as I'm recording votes, if Charity or someone wouldn't mind just letting me know if someone types something in the chat, that way I'm not waiting too long and wasting everyone's time. That would be really helpful. All right, so we've got a motion and a second. Jim Armour, how do you vote?
This has been good work. I vote aye.
Great, thank you. Greg Autry?
Aye.
Bill Beckman?
Aye.
Ed Bolton?
Ed concurs.
Great, thank you. Shanna was the second. Paul Dampus?
Aye.
Mary Lynn Dittmar?
Aye.
Mike French?
Mike votes aye.
Thank you. Chris Hassler? Nothing from Chris. Okay, we'll come back to Chris. Dale Ketchum?
Aye.
Kate Cronmiller?
Aye.
Steve Lindsay?
Aye.
Mike Moses? I didn't hear Mike. Mike, did you respond? Great, thank you. Clay made the motion. Dale Nash?
Aye.
Sharon Pinkerton?
Chris Hassler's back, by the way.
Thank you. How do you vote, Chris?
Aye.
Thank you. I'll come back to Sharon. Lee Rosen.
That's aye for Lee.
Thank you. Robbie Sabatier.
Aye.
Eric Stallmer.
Aye. Great work on this.
Thank you. Ann Tukolsky.
Aye.
And I vote aye. How does the chair vote?
I vote aye.
Thank you. So I think we might be missing Sharon Pinkerton unless someone captured her vote from the chat. Okay. Great. Motion passes.
And just one quick point, Jim Armour noted we had a misspelling on one of the charts, and we will get that updated. Minor, but we need to get that spelling correct. Thank you.
My thanks to the regulatory working group for the great conversation, discussion, and the recommendations for the ARC, and especially you, Shanna and Clay, and Anne and everyone else who participated. I'd like to propose we move straight forward to the the Infrastructure and Innovation Working Group, rather than take a 15-minute break, if everyone's okay with that. And hearing no objections, let's move forward to Paul and Lee. Over to you.
Great, thank you, Charity. And I think we've got everybody back on from attendee to panelists. If we can go ahead and pull up the charts. We had 3 tasks this time around, and tremendous amount of work on behalf of the members of the I&I working group. Thanks to Dale Nash, Dale Ketchum, Sharon Pinkerton, Ed Bolton, and co-chair Lee Rosen. So we were tasked with looking at 3 things, as I said. The first being a continuation of some of the work that we've been doing over several COMSTACs on spaceport grants. The second being electronic licensing. And then the third is really an outgrowth of the work that we've done in the last year or so on ranges, specifically now focused on the Eastern and Western range. So moving into the first task, we were asked to propose in detail a spaceport grant funding mechanism, to review past and current infrastructure grant funding mechanisms, and to propose improvements and best practices that will work for our industry. Dale Nash has been leading this for a number of cycles, both in this COMSTAC and a previous COMSTAC. So this is really getting down into the weeds now of what we're recommending for the spaceport grant mechanism. So with that, I will toss it over to Dale Nash as our grant lead for this task. Dale, over to you.
Thank you, Paul. Let's see, can we get the next chart? Okay. Observations, this should not be a surprise to anyone, but spaceport development is not playing out in the vacuum. You see many countries around the world getting into developing spaceports. The U.S. space launch superiority is in danger of eroding as we see this increased investment from our strategic competitors and allies as well. You see the UK and several others looking to get in the space launch business as well. It's our strategic competitors are certainly increasingly capable of competing directly with us. And we feel now is the time to consider and implement a new U.S. investments at FAA regulated spaceports. Like Paul talked, this has gone on for a long time. We need to get this done. There are investments that are going forward by several states and localities, and we don't want to be playing catch up in event of a potential conflict. Next slide. The working group agrees that the spaceport grant program is warranted in support of the national launch infrastructure and supported by the ecosystem of the U.S. spaceports. The Feedback from the group and the public is is that excuse me. Feedback is from the group and the public is that the Innovation and Integration Working Group is clear on its position that spaceports should not access the airport's improvement program funding that had been raised as a concern before. It was not intended when we talked about this, and we want to make sure that that is very clear. Also, the spaceport improvement program, if it were to mirror the AIP program, would not have sufficient funds for many years, similar to the AIP when it started out. So we are not proposing that this is funded by fees from spaceports. It needs to get in place now and support the investments that are being made and help build our critical infrastructure. Next slide. Our recommendations, and we have several pages here. So rather than repeat these, if you'll follow along with me, I'll make a motion at the end, but the Department of Transportation should implement a spaceport grant mechanism for the 21st century. Such a program would include the following elements. First, provisions for modest grant awards in the $1 to $10 million range for capital improvements and sustaining costs associated with space launch and reentry infrastructure necessary for access, including utilities, roads, power, etc., at U.S. FAA regulated launch and reentry sites. Second, incentives for cost sharing from state and local government, including investments from private companies, should be matched by providing additional matching funds up to a limit that can be set by the amount of funding that comes through, but somewhere in the neighborhood of $10 million we view as an upper limit on that. And we defer to Department of Transportation on the correct match. Believe that we would hope they would keep it in line with other DOT programs. And most DOT programs are an 80-20 split, 80% federal, 20% matched by the state and local governments. Next chart. DOT should implement a spaceport grant mechanism, again, for the 21st century. Number 3, include an award component based on activity level at the grantee site. Tiered approach or recognition of operational sites versus less mature sites in their development and contributions to the national infrastructure and non-federal funding contributions. And there have been some significant non-federal funding contributions. Support of the government launch should provide a framework to ensure money is used productively. And we recommend that the grant qualifications include signed launch or reentry contracts, whether it's commercial or government, as part of the criteria. Next slide. Fourth, we feel like a minimum of $50 million should be provided in the first year with top line growth. After that is appropriate to allow for meaningful awards to grantees. This number is justified based on the costs associated with building and sustaining space launch infrastructure. The working group notes that building out such an infrastructure with an eye towards use by multiple users can add significant costs to each shared item, particularly launch pads or supporting infrastructure, fuel farms, commodities, utilities. However, we're not saying that multi-use pads are the criteria at this time. They should not be excluded, but they should not be the hurdle to jump over either for the grants. And funding for these grants shall not be derived from user fees like AIP, certainly not at this time. And no spaceport should charge a separate fee for the infrastructure funded via these grants. Again, it took 40 years before airports got to a self-funded level. However, we're not saying that this precludes spaceports from charging the launch fee. That's how they get income in this as they get customers. Next slide. Finally, on recommendations, DOT should implement the spaceport grant program and run it through the FAA due to its vast experience administering similar programs across other transportation modalities. DOT should implement best practices from other large grant programs it runs for similar forms of costly infrastructure, such as the interstate highway programs, airport and seaport improvement programs, again, excluding funding derived via user fees. By utilizing the system and methodologies from other transportation domains, the spaceport grant program could be up and running very quickly and experience very minor growing pains. And administering such a program at DOT would have the additional benefit of contributing to the normalization of space transportation as a mode of transportation in the US, just like every other form of transportation that has matching grants set up now. So I would make a motion that we approve the recommendations here.
This is Dale Ketchum, second.
I think we have a question here. Mike French, do you have a question?
Yeah, I do. Thank you. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask about the $50 million in funding here. Are we recommending where we're seeking that funding? What account is, and is this new money, or is this money taken from a big part of an existing program? Thank you.
Discretionary funding, new money.
And new money where I assume it is not given the levels here, AST itself is at a $30 million around level for all its activity. I assume we are saying is this not asking for 50 million for AST for this purpose, or is there a specific account we're asking that where this should go?
We're asking it under the purview of Department of Transportation funding. If we get too specific, Mike, we're trying to write the law. What we are doing is recommending that the grant program be put in place.
Sure. I'm just as we look at the various things that we're interested in AST doing, or we know what we need to do over the next few years, resources are a big part of that. And so it's helpful to understand whether we're making any recommendation as to whether this is the next dollar we'd like to see go into AST's budget, or if we're specifically not talking about AST's budget here. I think that's just that's sort of where I'm getting at.
We have not recommended where it comes from.
Yeah, Mike, I can offer just a quick clarification. So when this tasker was assigned, when we started going through the content of the tasker, AST specifically asked us not to provide recommendations on where the funds could come from, but rather just to focus on what a grant program ought to look like if one were established. So if that helps to clarify a little bit.
Looks like Chris Hassler has a question. Chris, you have your hand up. Chris, if you're asking a question, you're on mute.
So this idea that you can use the space bar doesn't want to work so well. Hey, real quickly, Katrina may have answered my question. I wanted to know if there had been any discussion with the legislation that is going through the House right now on infrastructure improvements. Has this already been made a topic of discussion on the Hill, or is that something that is yet to occur?
I believe individuals have some spaceports, but not as COMSTAC as a whole.
So is there any provision for this in the current legislation that's being proposed on the Hill?
There may be, but I am not aware of it.
All right, thank you.
Okay, any other questions, discussions on this topic? I think we had a motion to vote on this topic, and I heard a second as well.
Paul, I'd like to see if there's one more comment here. I know Sharon was interested in this topic and she is not a panelist right now. And I want to see her if she has a question and if we can get her promoted to panelist.
I still see her on the attendee list, so she needs to get moved over. And Chris, if you could just put your hand down as well. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. I was really just trying to make sure that I was part of the panel so that I could support the recommendations. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharon. Any other discussion on that, Sharon? Otherwise, we'll move to a vote on this topic.
No, thank you.
Thanks, Sharon. Then I recommend we move to a vote. We have a motion and a second.
Okay, fantastic. Let's see, Jim Armour.
I vote aye.
Thank you. Greg Autry.
I vote aye, hoping somebody finds funding.
Bill Beckman.
Good point.
Bill Beckman. Okay, I've lost Bill. Ed Bolton.
Aye.
Shanna Dale.
Aye.
Paul, were you the second?
No, I was not, but I vote aye.
Okay. I didn't capture the second, so I apologize for that.
I think that might have been
Marilyn-
Dale Ketchum.
Got it. Marilyn Dittmar.
Aye.
Mike French.
Aye.
Thank you. Chris Hassler.
Aye.
Thank you. Dale Ketchum, can you just confirm you were the second or let me know your
I
vote?
was. I was.
Thanks. Kate Cronmiller.
Aye.
Steve Lindsay.
Aye.
Mike Moses.
I vote aye.
Clay Mowry.
Aye.
And Dale was the motion. Sharon Pinkerton.
Aye.
Lee Rosen.
Aye.
Robbie Sabatier.
Aye.
Eric Stallmer.
Aye.
Ann Zakolsky.
Aye.
And I vote aye. How does the chair vote?
I vote aye.
So I did not capture Bill Beckman. I don't know if he.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, there we go.
Aye.
Thank you, Bill. Fantastic. Motion passes. And Paul, feel free to move on to your next topic.
Absolutely, and thanks once again to Dale Nash for continuing this work on spaceport grants. And so we'll try to let you get into that full retirement, not a quasi-retirement after this. So keeping on our Dale theme, moving on to our separate task that was led by Dale Ketchum. And this was for us to look at how a fully electronic licensing application submission process might work at AST and recommend the best practices and industry preferences. We were really delighted to see the work that Michelle Murray and her team have been doing on what they're calling LEAP, that's Licensed Electronic Application Portal. So when we sat down with Michelle and her team, it was really kind of a bit of a running start, to look at the work that they'd already done and help work through some of the working around the edges of what they're already doing. So I think that they're off to a great start, but I will kick it over to Dale Ketchum to go into detail about our findings on this task. So Dale, over to you.
Very good. Thank you, Paul. This particular task actually proved to be quite easy. There wasn't a lot of controversy. The simple question is, do we want to come up with a better system, taking advantage of new technologies and capabilities to do the licensing? And everybody pretty much agreed, yeah, that's a good idea. Kudos again, as Paul mentioned, to the work the AST had already begun in terms of setting requirements for what this would look like. We also had the opportunity to touch base with the FCC, who has some background in providing better digitization, for lack of a better characterization, of licensing for their spectrum. And we learned a lot from them. I think we also solicited the information. Let's go to the next slide, just so we can run through the slides. This shouldn't take long. We also floated this out for additional input through other organizations like CSF and GSA and others. And I think for the most part, we've been real happy with the responses we've got, because they basically were, it was evidence that it was reinforcing the work that AST had already begun, and which I think was encouraging that they're on the right track. Next slide, please. It was clear that the existing system, it's kind of antiquated. It's just, you know, a lot of human activity using email and documents through email, which is not the most efficient manner. I think the desire was to put in place, by improving the system, making it more electronic, we can provide better milestones and metrics, which I think is a really important thing, because that will give us the opportunity to hold accountable both the government and industry more readily and transparently in the process that's already almost by definition slow and methodical. I think everybody recognizes it's going to be impossible to get the federal government to do anything that isn't slow and methodical, but there is efficiencies that can be introduced into the system. And I think this is a positive step that everybody was excited about. I think one of the common themes was, and additionally it was reinforced both by AST and FCC, that try to stay away from using custom software for just this system, and more appropriately, as is evidence in the commercial space business and the government's utilization of it, go to the marketplace and see what commercial activities and capabilities are out there and tap into them, because that's obviously a better way to do business. Next, please. Again, one of the common themes was a desire to make sure we put in place and be distinctly attentive to all of the marketplace's requirements that would be utilized here, which would be everything from national security payloads and the classification requirements there, in addition to proprietary and intellectual property, and also ITAR implications, because it is a global marketplace, which is going to demand a secure web server system. Again, no surprise, but that was a common theme. But I think if we do it right, and hopefully understanding that's not an easy to accomplish, but it's a simple goal, and that would enhance the security. And I think additionally, part of the process, and again, it's sort of an aspirational goal, is how do we figure out a mechanism within this process that will better enable the process to identify a complete enough to move to the next step. So you're not being held up because of a nit on one process that's not enabling you to go to the next step, when that's obviously something you could go back to. Again, those are challenging. It sounds simple, but doing so within a federal or any government or large enterprise activity, that's going to be a challenge. But I think that's an aspirational goal we'd like to go in and highlight. Next, please. But again, the recommendation is, yea, verily, go forth. Continue the activity, continue to solicit input, and get about the business of designing this, and with the understanding that this is not something that's going to be all of a sudden they're going to roll out a great system, but let's take, it should be an iterative process, and let's look for simple things that we can license using this process, execute it, and learn from it as a small victories as we build forward. It was encouraging to see the number of companies that were more than happy to volunteer to be part of a pilot project to help roll this out. But I think it's also evident and that AST is going to need to, the recommendation was that have people specifically dedicated to this task that can be responsible for it. You're not, which would significantly increase the likelihood of success and expediency. And I think the highest aspirational goal is that we move towards a system more like aviation, where you don't go through an elaborate licensing process for every flight, but the process is mature and reliable and safe enough so that we can get towards a position where you just file and fly a flight plan. And again, that's an aspirational goal, but we'd like to have our reach exceed our grasp, at least at this point. And I think that's it for me.
Great. Thanks for your work on this, Dale. And we'll open it up for discussion. And we do have at least one question from the website. So I'll open it up to the COMSTAC for questions or discussion.
If you need me to move, make a motion and then seek a second, then we'll go into discussion. That's fine. I'll move.
Second.
Okay, let me just cover the question that came in over the website, and I'll just read this verbatim. Would COMSTAC recommend the transition from mail to license portal? And if a 450 license was started prior to the rollout of the portal, should it continue through email, or should it be ported into the electronic system?
I don't want to feel as though I'm qualified to answer that question absolutely, but I would think since we don't have the system yet, if you've already started, you need to continue on the path you're on. Subject to being overruled by AST, that would certainly be what I would think.
You know, I do recall one thing that came up in the exchange that we had with Michelle and her team is that the electronic system that's envisioned would not be exclusive, that there would still be the ability to do things more in a traditional fashion, maybe over email, in addition to a new electronic system. So I think the answer to that is that it could continue if that's what the desires are that way, and then it could be ported over as the system comes up online. Okay, any other discussion from the COMSTAC before we move to a vote? Okay, hearing none, I think we're ready to vote on this one.
Great, we've got a motion and a second. Jim Armour, how do you vote?
I vote aye.
Greg
Nice work,
Autry?
Bill.
Thanks.
Aye.
Bill Beckman?
Aye.
Ed Bolton?
Aye.
Shanna Dale?
Aye.
Paul Dampus?
Vote aye.
Mary Lynn Dittmar?
Aye.
Mike French?
Aye.
Chris Hassler?
Aye.
Dale Ketchum made the motion. Kate Cronmiller?
Aye.
Steve Lindsay?
Aye.
Mike Moses had the second. Clay Morey?
Aye.
Dale Nash?
Aye.
Sharon Pinkerton? Someone could let me know if Sharon responds in the chat. That'd be great. Lee Rosen?
Aye.
Robbie Spatier?
Aye.
Eric Stallmer?
Aye.
Ann Zakowski?
Aye.
And I'll vote aye. How does the chair vote?
I think a 21st century launch industry needs a 21st century licensing system, so I vote aye.
Excellent. So I have not captured Sharon Pinkerton. So I'll keep checking the chat, Sharon, otherwise the motion passes. Easily.
Okay.
And Paul, go ahead to your next item.
Outstanding. So I was remiss in mentioning up front that for these first two tasks, they are accompanied by white papers that will be posted on the COMSTAC website. We do have one saved round going back to Dale Nash. We'll pull you out of retirement again, but there was a question that came in from the website, and I will read that to you, Dale, if you want to take it just really quickly. And again, I'll read it verbatim. Regarding spaceport grants, would all these rewards, and I think they mean grants, would be for post-land acquisition development? Would there be any grant rewards for municipal or private organizations to acquire the land for spaceport development? That was a question from the website, Dale, if you'd like to tackle that one.
That's probably a little in the weeds. I'm not sure how the highways and the seaports and airports handle land acquisition, but I would assume that DOT would set up a grant system very similar to what they had. So someone who may be more knowledgeable about that for land acquisition may be able to weigh in, but what we're asking is it mirrors very closely the grant systems that they use for other transportation modalities.
Great. Thank you, Dale. Appreciate it. Okay, if we can move on to the next slide. So our final task dealt with the eastern and western ranges, and as the COMSTAC knows, this has been an evolving task over the last year plus for us, really spurred on by a number of activities to sort of converge on a national spaceport strategy or some type of an activity there. So in the springtime, we were given this task, more narrowly focused on, again, on the eastern and western ranges. So there were a number of elements of things that we were asked to do. So this is going to be a little bit more in depth for this topic, but there were 5 things that we were asked to do. We were asked to familiarize ourselves with the evolving challenges at Cape Canaveral Spaceport Station and Vandenberg Space Force Base by reading the applicable reference documents, which we'll go into just a little bit, including the National Spaceport Development Corporation white paper. We were asked to compose a broad list of commercial space transportation industry stakeholders that would include discussion involving governance changes resulting in a new spaceport strategy and address these challenges. Next slide, please. The third element was to broadly define the categories of spaceport facilities and services currently provided by DoD to commercial operators at the eastern and western range. Fourth item was to compile a list of general challenges for the broader commercial space transportation industry, as well as for new U.S. national security. And then the fifth element was to consult our members and collect their feedback on how any of these governance changes at these sites would positively or negatively affect their operations. I think this really has been a whole of COMSTAC effort, and I think we answered all 5 of these things, through consultation with subject matter experts and through the COMSTAC membership. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of background to tee this up. We did have some internal discussions about the tasking itself and whether it was apropos to the COMSTAC and AST charter, that being, the regulatory role and the facilitate, encourage, and promote role. And Jim Hatt was kind enough to dig into some of the language and pulled up some of the language that yes, said that this is apropos, that we should be looking at this, that the Secretary of Transportation should oversee and coordinate commercial launch and reentry operations to include elements of national security, foreign policy, interests of the United States, facilitate the strengthening and expansion of the U.S. space transportation infrastructure with government, state, private sector involvement to support the full range of U.S. space-related activities. Continuing on there to the next slide. Again, staying with Title 51 language, that stated that AST was to establish an office of spaceports, and part of that role was to strengthen the nation's competitiveness in commercial space transportation infrastructure and increase the resilience of the federal government and commercial customers. Next slide, please. Further on to this background, the 2020 NDAA specifically tasked the Department of Defense, the Secretary of Defense, to work with the administrator of FAA to carry out programs to enhance infrastructure and improve support activities specifically for DoD small class and medium class payloads. And under the program, look at improvements to operations at launch ranges and FAA licensed spaceport that are consistent with necessary to permit the use of such launch ranges and spaceports by the department. So you can see there's a lot of synergies here between FAA and DoD. So that's a little bit of a preamble into the task itself. Next slide, please. So continuing on to the background of within the task itself, DoD continues to meet its national security space launch mission of assured access through Cape Canaveral Space Force Station and Vandenberg Space Force Base. But DoD is limited in its ability to improve infrastructure and to streamline the operations to meet the growing commercial demand at these locations. It was clear that DoD recognizes the importance of maintaining and enhancing the infrastructure and the ranges that it's needed to support not only national security space, but civil space, commercial space missions as well. And obviously the launch cadence is increasing, particularly on the Eastern Range. Next slide, please. So DoD is tasked to provide excess capacity at these locations for commercial launches, which are licensed, of course, by AST. But now when this decision was made several years ago, DoD had the lion's share of the launches, and there was the occasional commercial launch that were supported on the ranges. It can be argued that that calculus is now inverted, that the vast majority of launches on the, particularly on the Eastern Range, are commercial launches. DoD also is now a consumer of that commercial launch, and they know that it's in their interest to address, to advance commercial space transportation, and they are willing to address their role as a launch site operator. DoD envisions contracting launch and insertion of spacecraft into orbit by commercial vendors, while not necessarily maintaining the launch site infrastructure that they only use occasionally. DoD postulated that it is in their best interests of the national security that their appropriated funds for infrastructure be used more appropriately for strictly military operations. Next slide, please. So in all of this effort, one possible means of achieving this mission transformation came in the form of a paper that came out in August of last year for the U.S. Space Force that proposed a National Spaceport Development Corporation governance model for both the Cape and Vandenberg. So next slide, please. So moving into the discussion, again, digging into what we did for this task, it was fairly exhaustive with a great amount of effort on behalf of the I&I working group, but on the COMSTAC as a whole, really. This really was a whole of COMSTAC. We engaged several subject matter experts, chief of which was General Raymond, Chief of Space Operations. The General gave us a full hour. His staff was hugely supportive of that, and he was very transparent in a lot of his very high-level strategic thinking. The General also made available to us on separate occasions Major General Burt, who's the Vice Commander of Space Operations Command, Brigadier General Purdy, who's the Commander of Space Launch Delta 45 down at the Cape. We also met with Bob Cabana while he was the Director of Kennedy Space Center. Now he's moved up to NASA headquarters. We separately met with Janet Patron after she took over down at the Cape. We spent some time last year speaking with Mr. Richard Lamb, who's a systems director at the Aerospace Corporation, who has been intimately involved in this on behalf of not only aerospace, but U.S. Space Force. And then we spent time with the Spaceport Committee through CSF, and of course, several conversations, in-depth conversations and feedback from COMSTAC members and other companies. Next slide, please. We also did a literature, staying on the theme of the SMEs, we challenged them with several questions. For the operators, we asked what their current challenges are operating on the Eastern and Western ranges. If there was a status quo to spaceflight operations and governance, how would they be affected? We also asked them what are some of the issues that they see if a transfer of oversight of some of the logistical and administrative functions at the ranges went from DoD to to some non-DoD entity. And then finally, we asked, what are some of the challenges that changes to governance at these sites pose for the broader space transportation industry? And we got lots of input. Next slide. So moving into the relevant documentation, really at a top level, February of 2022, Space Force published its future 2028 strategic intent document. And that said, evolve the Eastern and Western Range capabilities for multiple users simultaneously, deliver equitable access to resources while improving upon the system services and infrastructure, transform the range business model to accommodate industry while preserving capabilities, and then evolve and integrate ranges into national space transportation and commerce systems. So with this document, you see the strategic intent on behalf of the Space Force to really provide this transformative environment, taking into account a lot of the new commercial activity. Next slide, please. We also reviewed from the Global Space Alliance, led by Dr. George Neal, the National Spaceport Network Development Plan. The white paper, which I mentioned in the preamble, was the National Spaceport Strategy prepared for the CSO in August of 2020. And that paper pointed out a lack of funding for infrastructure maintenance, range upgrades and expansion, competition for resources with an increased launch cadence, and statutory language limiting DoD's ability to accept outside funds for infrastructure. This paper also recommended that National Space Development Corporation. We also got a really in-depth briefing, as I said, from Bob Cabana and their vision for KSC as a multi-use spaceport, a document that outlined that. Next slide, please. So overarching observations and challenges. So I will say that we took all of the comments that we got from NASA and all of the comments that we received from US Space Force, and we aggregated those into a separate set of slides just for reasons of brevity here. We pulled those slides out and those will be put on the website separately. But again, that's an aggregate of the observations that they provided to us in the course of our document reviews and our SME discussions. So obviously launch is critical to the US, and we recognize that there is a diversity of options needed. These are complex issues. There's multiple stakeholders affecting governance and economics. And while at a very high level, everybody is rowing in the same direction, there are some differences of opinion on how some of the things move forward and how things are executed. Pace of launch, obviously, we've seen it this year and previous years that launch is picking up, and collaboration and urgency is needed. It's desperately needed to continue moving forward. But what we've seen, and again, these observations are on behalf of the commercial industry, the COMSTAC and the commercial sector. And what we've seen in our analysis is that the current approach really doesn't address the larger issue of a lack of a national spaceport strategy. But the things that are out there, that document review, the SME interviews that we've done, really shows that there's not one solution for the national space launch enterprise that's really ready to proceed at this time. So really the overarching piece of this is, absent those agreements and solutions, we could see some deterioration in the capabilities on the Eastern and Western Range. That could increase risk, could decrease competitiveness, and potentially create issues with safety. Next slide, please. So just a few elements of the overarching observations. Finance and costs. One thing that came out in these discussions was the idea of passing on indirect costs to some of the users. Some of the comments that we got were that those indirect costs could cause prices to go up significantly, and that could have an impact on competitiveness. Because without equitable and appropriate cost sharing, some of those changes could prove unfair to some of the providers, some of the frequent users, who may be disincentivized if they have to pick up the majority of the cost for the benefit of some who may be their direct competitors. Some of those providers who are looking at do we still work with government services, or we go off and do it ourselves? They're making those trades for range services. They could opt to go elsewhere and make the funding pool actually smaller. So in some ways, it could have the reverse effect of the intent. Those launch providers have choices. If the government ranges are not efficient or they're not inexpensive, those providers could go elsewhere and build their own facilities. Next slide, please. Right now, the buy the drink model works for services so long as the prices are kept under control. There's really a strong sentiment that federal funds should be used for federal infrastructure, and that we need to avoid things like tasking DoD personnel for some expensive and unnecessary tasks, like things like setting up roadblocks and simple logistics. That gets expensive when the launch provider has to pay the government for those fairly straightforward activities. Next slide, please. With regard to shared infrastructure, and there's a couple of points that you'll see that cross over from some of our previous tasks to this task. The idea of a multi-user pad and infrastructure right now is currently not compatible with most commercial launch solutions. There's too many different engines, propellant types, support structures, plumbing, hold downs. All of those things are generally fairly bespoke to a specific launch provider's architecture. So meeting the plug and play design on a shared use pad would likely sub-optimize that system unless the operator is already using the clean pad, clean slab of concrete design. So with the high launch cadence and risks imposed by multiple users, it also makes shared use of the pad not practical. You know, if you're using a pad and your competitor has a mishap on that pad and it takes the pad out, that's going to affect your competitiveness as well. One other point about specifically down at the Cape, the relationship between DoD, Kennedy, and Space Florida is sometimes confusing, is difficult for some of the folks who work down there. Sometimes the companies don't know with whom they're actually negotiating. So that was another theme that came out of this. The next slide, please. Other spaceports. So we are, again, this task got narrowly focused on the eastern and western ranges, but there are 12 FAA licensed spaceports, and many of them are not on the eastern and western range. The majority of them are not, and some of them are, many of them are inland. So really the takeaway from this one was that they're concerned that if there is a national spaceport activity, but it's only focused on the eastern and western range, they may be kind of disadvantaged, and they may be left on their own to have to get local and state funding as opposed to federal funding. That was a concern that was expressed through some of the spaceport operators. Next slide, please. Pretty straightforward on the legislation. The law could simply be changed to allow the government to fund infrastructure that could be used for commercial as well as other national security and civil space purposes. Next slide. Some additional challenges. I think there was just this one that we put under additional challenges, and that has to do with polar launch. You know, we've now enabled polar launch out of the Cape. It's an enabling capability. It's flexible, but it's difficult in the perspective of seasonal weather patterns. We have one of our members that had a payload sit on the pad for a number of weeks, waiting for a very narrow weather window to be able to launch into that polar orbit. So a reassessment of those requirements and assumptions could take place to make polar launches a little bit more practical. Next slide. I believe this is, yes, this is our last slide. So we are recommending in this context and for this task, 2 next steps: that an activity should be formed to address a strategy for the nation's eastern and western ranges. It's really important, the membership of that activity, that it include all of the government stakeholders, but as importantly, that it has equal representation from the commercial sector, including specifically launch providers. Whether that's something where there's an interagency activity that meets and then brings in the commercial sector, or if we have some type of a user group that has everybody in the same room. We really need to get all of these voices and all of these stakeholders heard and hammer out what is the next bullet, a national spaceport strategy, which should be created to ensure the best outcomes for the collective U.S. National security, civil, and commercial launch enterprises. So once again, I appreciate the tremendous amount of work that was done on behalf of the I&I working group over the summer, and for all of the COMSTAC members who provided really a high level of granularity for some of these observations. And a special thanks to Karina, who we kind of worked this thing hand in hand, because it was such an important topic and it was so cross-cutting across the COMSTAC. So with that, I will stop there and open it up for discussion.
You want a second, Paul? This is Dale.
Yes, so I move to open discussion. Dale?
I'll second.
Very good, thank you.
I would just like to note the absolute heroic work of Paul and everyone who was involved in this. In fact, the entire COMSTAC were in discussion of this topic since the spring altogether. So really applaud everyone's cooperation in getting this one done.
I ditto that remark, and including you and Karina. A lot of work was done, but I think it's been very well summarized. So very well summarized here. So I think we have a pretty good way forward. And when you come to me, my vote will be aye.
Jim Armour?
I yeah, this is excellent work. Thanks, Paul and the gang. Did we discuss whether this was worthy of recommending going to the National Space Council? I know they've started up, but this particular issue might be worthy at that level. And I vaguely remember maybe us discussing it, but I can't remember if we did or not.
We did discuss that most recently in the last few weeks. We did attempt to reach out to see if this would percolate up to that level. Really what we've gotten from the National Space Council so far are really kind of some top line strategic thrusts. So I guess the answer to the question is maybe, because if you do look at this slide, many of the entities that are represented here are also represented on the National Space Council. I know that Charity and Karina had some outreach to Chirag, but I don't know that we've heard back.
Jim, I think it's one thing. I think in a perfect world, I think people agree it'd be great if they would go champion this and get this done. In the world we actually live in, if you can't even get them to return calls, I'm not sure what the point is.
Okay. I have no other comments.
Paul, I believe the intent here was to vote on the next steps as a recommendation. Do you agree?
That's right. That's
Okay.
right. We're going to vote on these two bullets. It's really the activity with not limited to the stakeholders that are on the screen, but certainly a high representation on behalf of the commercial sector, and then an output of that is a real national spaceport strategy. So those are the two that we're voting on.
Any other discussion? Okay, over to you, Paul, to recommend these next steps and a motion to move forward to vote.
I'm just taking a quick glance to see if there were any questions that came through on the website. Not seeing any. I think we're ready to move to a vote. I move to vote on this one.
And Lee seconds.
Thank you, Lee.
Excellent. I'll call for a vote. And I just want to say real quickly, Paul, this was an enormous amount of work for you personally. I think you're now the worldwide expert on this topic. So thank you so much for everything you've done to get us to this point. It's really appreciated.
Well, it's like I said, it was really a whole of COMSTAC, and there's some real experts on this that provided some real good fidelity on some of this. So I appreciate that.
Thanks, Paul. I'll call for a vote here. So Jim Armour,
Aye.
Greg Autry,
Aye.
Bill Beckman,
Aye.
Ed Bolton.
Aye, still.
Great. Shanna Dale.
Aye.
Paul, I've got you as making the motion. Mary Lynn Dittmar.
Aye.
Mike French.
Aye.
Chris Hassler.
Aye.
Dale Ketchum.
Aye.
Kate Cronmiller.
No.
Okay. Steve Lindsay.
Aye.
Mike Moses.
Aye.
Okay. Clay Mowry.
Aye.
Dale Nash.
Aye.
Sharon Pinkerton. Lee, I've got
Aye.
you making the second. Okay, thanks, Sharon.
Yep.
Lee, I've got you as the second. Robbie Spatier.
Aye.
Thank you. Eric Stalmer.
Aye.
Ann Zakolsky.
Aye.
Ann, was that an aye?
Yes, aye.
Great. I will vote aye. How does the chair vote?
I vote aye.
Excellent. The motion passes. Thank you, everybody.
Okay. So next up on our agenda, we're going to take a break until 1:30. We'll be back at 1:30 for public comments and new business. Okay, Jim, are we back on?
Yes, we are back on. And if you are ready, if there are no other discussions on things that have been brought up, we'll open it up for the public comment period. And we did receive from Mr. George Neal a request to address COMSTAC. So if you're ready, Mr. Neal, if you would, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jim and Charity and members of the COMSTAC. I appreciate you allowing me to speak to you today. My name is Dr. George Neal, and I'm currently serving as the chairman of the Global Spaceport Alliance, or GSA. GSA was formed in 2015 with the goal of creating a global network of spaceports that will allow increased access to space and that can serve as focal points and technology hubs in growing the space economy. The group currently has 23 member spaceports and 13 associated nonprofit member organizations from 10 different countries all over the world. We hold an annual Spaceport Caucus, which in 2022 will be held in Orlando on January the 10th in conjunction with the SpaceCom conference. And we're actively involved in partnering with stakeholders at NASA, US Space Force, and the FAA, as well as with industry and academia. This afternoon, I'd like to highlight two topics that I believe are appropriate for careful consideration by the committee: non-launch flight operations and spaceport infrastructure funding. So first, on non-launch flight operations, it's long been recognized that the current system for authorizing the flight of hybrid vehicles, that is, launch or reentry vehicles that have some of the characteristics of aircraft and some of the characteristics of launch vehicles, may be more confusing, inefficient, and bureaucratic than is necessary in the ideal world. In the US Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act of 2015, Congress directed the Secretary of Transportation to prepare a report on approaches for streamlining the licensing and permitting process of launch vehicles, reentry vehicles, or components of launch or reentry vehicles to enable non-launch flight operations related to space transportation. And in its response to Congress, the Department of Transportation's recommended approach to enable non-launch flights of hybrid vehicles was to authorize their flight with a launch license or experimental permit. this approach would not remove any options that are currently available to an operator. So we're not taking away any authorities or responsibilities. The report, which was submitted on June 29, 2017, noted that allowing non-launch flight operations to be conducted under a launch license or experimental permit would streamline the process by allowing a vehicle's full flight envelope to be flown under a single license or permit from DOT, rather than requiring operations under two different regulatory regimes. Now, implementing such a system would require Congress to change current law. And I've included in my statement an example of some potential legislative language that would allow such an approach. And it's based on taking the language from the FAA reauthorization of 2018, which provided a statutory definition of a space support vehicle, and just tweaking that a little bit. Right now, the law defines a space support vehicle as a vehicle that is a launch vehicle, a reentry vehicle, or a component of a launch or reentry vehicle. And that's a great start, but I think it would be significantly improved if we added in a vehicle in development to become a launch vehicle, reentry vehicle, or component of a launch or reentry vehicle. Or an aircraft when it conducts a space support flight. And the additional improvement would be then to allow the Secretary of Transportation, and by delegation, the FAA and Office of Commercial Space Transportation, to authorize those space support vehicle flights through a license or permit. And if we did that, then there are a number of different launch operators that could benefit from this type of streamlining. That would include Northrop Grumman with its Elkin 11 and Pegasus, Virgin Galactic with White Knight 2 and Spaceship 2, or Spaceship 3, or any other follow-on vehicles, any kind of glide flights that might need to do in the future. Virgin Orbit with its Boeing 747 and Launcher One, Stratolaunch with Rock and any air launch systems that it would carry in the future. And at least two other hybrid launch systems that I'm aware of that are currently under development, but that have not yet been publicly announced. Now, there's a separate but potentially very significant benefit of this commercial human spaceflight training. NASA has long had its astronaut train in the T-38. And as y'all know, in September, SpaceX conducted the Inspiration 4 mission with 4 non-professional astronauts on board. I want to salute both SpaceX and the Inspiration 4 astronauts for how seriously they took their pre-flight training. And Jared Isaacman, who organized the mission, actually arranged for each person to fly in high-performance jets so that they would be better prepared for their spaceflight experience. So that was great. But unfortunately, future commercial astronauts may not be able to have that same opportunity unless they happen to own or have access to former military aircraft and are willing to provide free flights for their fellow crew members. And that's because current law prohibits the operation of experimentally certificated aircraft for compensation or hire. But with the changes we're talking about here, commercial crew members or spaceflight participants would be able to receive spaceflight training in experimental aircraft under the same informed consent regime that AST uses today for commercial human spaceflight. So I think that adding an opportunity for more realistic training would almost certainly result in an increase in the safety of commercial space flights. And it would also allow launch operators to better screen prospective customers ahead of their space missions to minimize the chance, for example, that they would have a panic attack or get violently ill during maneuvers. Now, the second topic I wanted to highlight was spaceport infrastructure funding. I thought there was some great discussion as part of the working group session earlier today. But from the perspective of our Global Spaceport Alliance members, there are really several different options that could be used to provide the needed federal support for spaceports infrastructure, including the Airport Improvement Program, the Space Transportation Infrastructure Matching Grants Program, the Department of Transportation Discretionary Grants Program, and the potential joint DoD FAA infrastructure program. Again, that was mentioned earlier by Mr. Danfus. Any of those options would be better than the existing situation, which is a complete absence of federal funding. However, each of those approaches has some limitations and disadvantages. So GSA is recommending that there be a new program that would take advantage of the experience that we've had in the past and some of the lessons learned we've been able to gather from previous and existing infrastructure grant programs, while incorporating modifications as appropriate to meet the unique requirements associated with commercial space transportation. And the new program could and should evolve over time, for example, to become larger and even eventually to be self-funded like the airport improvement program is today. But as was discussed earlier, we're not at that point yet. But just with the inputs from our US members of GSA, we've identified 44 different potential infrastructure projects with a total cost of over $382 million. And these are at 10 different US spaceports. So given that, we think it's vital that the FAA immediately begin working with Congress to start providing the needed financial assistance. Now, I think this is a perfect example of the government needing to move more quickly in order to keep pace with industry. So if there's any particular questions, I'm happy to address that. Otherwise, again, thank you so much for allowing me to speak to the group today, and I look forward to supporting the COMSTAC's efforts on these very important issues. Thank you, Charity.
Thank you, Dr. Neild, for your comments. Your insights are always valuable, and we really appreciate you taking the time in each of these COMSTAC meetings to bring them forward. I'll open it up to the members if they have any questions for Dr. Neild. Okay, seeing none, thank you, Dr. Neild. And Jim, are there any other questions on the website that we need to address here?
There was one question that came in on the website, and it is in general, and it's actually for AST, but I'll answer it publicly here and I'll read it. Are you getting broad support from all other countries in regard to collaboration efforts on licensing? And this is in regards to spaceports. Are there any that are attempting to stymie these efforts? And the answer is we are getting very good support from all other countries in our licensing efforts, and we have not run into any country or anything that is trying to stymie our efforts in this area. I got that from Pam. She unfortunately had to drop off for this afternoon, but we are getting very good cooperation and collaboration from other governments. And that is the last of the questions that are on the website. I will mention again that if you're tuned in on YouTube, there should be a link there where you can type in questions and it'll come over. Or if you are on our COMSTAC website, there's a link there to ask questions, and that question portal will be open until COMSTAC is completed. Charity, back over to you.
Okay, thank you. We'll still be open to taking those questions until for a little bit more here as we move into the next item, which is new business. So I'll open it up to the COMSTAC members to bring forward any thoughts, ideas, items that you'd like COMSTAC to address, maybe in this next session or the ones after that. Just open it up to you at this point. Thank you. I'm actually gonna put Paul on the spot here. Paul, if you don't mind. I know you're interested in point-to-point flight, and I was wondering if you could explain that a little bit and the urgent need or the need of maybe COMSTAC to discuss it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Charity, for that opportunity. Put together a very short white paper back in the spring on what we are sort of calling high-speed aerospace technology. And, you know, I think it initially lends itself to potentially being part of traditional FAA if it's an air breathing system. But some of these systems start to get into the higher parts of the atmosphere, and then they start blurring the line between whether it is a point-to-point vehicle and or an orbital vehicle or something in between, like maybe a boost glide or a skipping off the top of the atmosphere. And I know of, just right off the top of my head right now, just of two architectures that are in development right now that really will kind of blur the lines there. And so I put together that paper for the COMSTAC's consideration, or the AST's consideration, as to should we now start kind of getting out in front of making a very open regulatory regime for those type of vehicles that do kind of blur the lines a little bit. I think it's important that we do that engagement early. So with that, the paper is available for others' consumption. I believe it's I think it's with AST, right, Jim?
Yes, we have it.
Great.
We're reviewing it.
Yeah, and I think there's a handful of members of the COMSTAC that not only are have concerns with spaceports and human spaceflight regulations and orbital and reentry type of things, but there are others. There are folks who are thinking about point-to-point architectures as well.
What kind of time horizon do you see for this, Paul?
I think if you'd asked me earlier in the year, I probably would have given one answer, but now I would say it's accelerated. I've seen some funding come out in the last couple of months on a few of these architectures, which makes me believe that it's some of these things are going to start bending metal and flying sooner than we realize. So I would certainly say within, conservatively, maybe 5 years, maybe even sooner on some of these.
Okay, thank you. Any other items, new business to be brought up today from members? We got a quiet bunch here today, Jim.
I know. I was just going to comment on that. Everybody is very quiet.
It looks like we've resolved everything in the earlier session, but should there be no other comments or inputs, I'd like to hand it back to Jim to talk about upcoming taskers for this next session. Jim?
Ready? All right, thank you. And so the next session or the next public meeting of COMSTAC will be, is tentatively scheduled for 15 March 2022. And I am hoping that the world and viruses and everything else cooperate, and we can do that meeting in person here in Washington, D.C. But with that, for the work plan that will be due in March 2022, next slide, please. Following on a couple things. Next slide. Review and make recommendations on updating the guidance documents. You've done that. And I'd like you to take in AST, and the government is asking you to take an additional step beyond that macro level to approach to any potential future rulemaking covering human spaceflight. What are those large chunks that we need to be looking at? And as we move forward, we'll define that a little bit more, and as you start to work through this. Next slide, please. We are not ready to propose new regulations under Part 460. And we are not asking for regulatory language. But as a follow-on to the work that has already been done, we're looking to get your advice, recommendation, and observations on the scope and scale of potential future human spaceflight regulation. Also provide recommendations on the glide slope for a transition plan to move from where we are today to that regulatory regime sometime out there in the future. Again, this is not saying regulation is going to be put in place at any particular time, but just, again, like Paul mentioned, let's get out ahead of things. So this is looking towards the future. And you all have done an absolutely outstanding work so far on human spaceflight, and I can't thank you enough for that work. Let's just move that ball just a little bit further down the field. All right, next slide, please. Regarding Part 440, you have recommended that be the next rulemaking effort, and you have provided some good information today and kind of an update. And we would like you to finish up that recommendation. And I think you are on a great path to get that done. Just need a little bit more time. So looking for that final report to come back out in March of 2022 at the next COMSTAC public meeting. Next. And that's the finish up of that task. All right. Something absolutely new given the global climate change we face and the need to make changes to government and industry that we must make to change the future. COMSTAC advice is needed on what research is necessary to move the industry forward regarding climate change. As we're going to hear this afternoon from the Vice President, this administration is looking to space for many things, and one of those is to help with not only just monitor climate change, but make changes to the way we do business, the way we think and work and handle our climate here on Earth. We're all kind of in this together. So are there recommendations or advice from industry on this critical strategic area of concern? What are those areas that the government needs to be looking at? Are there any research projects or things that we need to be doing? And again, the final recommendation language coming up in March. And next. And then as we were presented this earlier today from Charles Hewitt, we have quite a few advisory circulars yet to do. A few of them are just around the corner and we're closing in on getting those published. But given the remaining advisory circulars, we would like your recommendation on the priority for their completion, because as we know that it does take a while. So are there some of those that should be prioritized above others? Well, that's what we're looking for with task number 4. And then we'll be looking at the white paper that Paul put forward and working out and thinking about that as a potential task number 5. Are there any questions?
Jim, is there going to be more details on task number 3 on climate change? Are you looking to aggregate industries' ESG efforts? Are you looking to have anything more specific here?
Really just looking for advice on what's out there. Not specifically do research on alternative fuels necessarily, but where do we on the space transportation side look? And as we start digging into this one, again, what is COMSTAC's advice to the government, whether it's very specific or in broad? Of course, the more specific, the more actionable it is. But I think that first step is what are the general areas, or are there some specific things that we need to be looking at, either from a research or potentially regulatorial constructs to address climate change?
Thank you. Members, any questions for Jim?
And Jim, is this it?
An email?
Go ahead.
It's Greg.
Please.
You'll send these out to us in email?
Absolutely, yes.
And Jim, you're open to additional suggestions?
Sure.
Great.
Jim, this is Shanna. On task 3, climate change, is your focus, because I look, you know, in regards to space industry, you could certainly talk about maybe cleaner fuels along the way. And I know NASA has been working on that issue. You could also talk about the very practical implications of climate change in regards to impact on existing ranges, and then also maybe some of the interior spaceports as well. When I was at NASA many years ago, they had some of that work done in regards to impact to KSC and their projections going forward. So, you know, it impacts us in different ways. Are you going in a particular direction when you say climate change and how we're looking at it from AST's perspective? Is it more of how can we start to talk to individuals about fuel choices in the future research that's being done, or is it more practical implications of what people are going to be facing on the ground in terms of changing climate, or is it something else that I'm missing?
No, it's both of those, and you know, anything else. Absolutely wide open for recommendations and advice. There's no specific target here. Pretty wide open.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
And I guess a follow-up to that, Jim, and this is getting ahead of ourselves, but any recommendations or observations that we provide to DOT, is this intended for National Space Council inputs and some sort of larger effort?
It could be. You know, and initially, this is thought of as are there things AST needs to be focusing research on, or potentially focusing regulation on, or partnering with industry, other government agencies. For example, Shanna mentioned ranges and the impacts of climate change on, and I guess I'm putting words in your mouth, ma'am, sorry. You know, as raising, as the sea level rises and a lot of our launch facilities happen to be on the coast, you know, are there impacts there that we need to be looking at? And is there any advice on how to look at that or what to do with that? So again, pretty wide open as we move forward.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
All right, seeing no other hands up, let's move on to the end of our session today with just some closing remarks from myself and Karina. I just want to let everyone know here, our members, that it's been a real pleasure to work with you the last 6 months. I look forward to the next few months until the March meeting. I completely understand this has been a very difficult time, and as we get to see each other in person, I'm very relieved to meet many of you in person for the first time over the past few months, and I'm going to continue to seek out in-person contact as we open up even further. So just want to thank everyone for their tireless work. Really appreciate it. And Karina and and Jim, we're here if you have any questions, concerns, and look forward to the next few months. And Karina, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Charity. I just wanted to kind of reiterate that how much everyone has worked to get to this point. And, there's no doubt that we're all here because we have an interest in advancing America's space program, and we're all, working together to try to put forth very thoughtful recommendations to AST. And I really appreciate the work that's gone into that as well. And oftentimes it's challenging when the industry is evolving right before our eyes. So we are, anticipating a lot more growth in the industry, a lot more activity, and believe here that our work here is even more important than before. So thanks again to everybody.
I'll open it up for any last comments, and then I'll turn it over to Jim to close us up. Okay, Jim, floor is yours.
All right, and before I have closing remarks, I'd like to offer the Associate Administrator for Commercial Space Transportation if he would like to add any closing comments for COMSTAC.
Thanks, Jim. And yes, I will. I'll keep this relatively succinct. But Charity, Karina, thank you again for your leadership, and to the entire COMSTAC for your tremendous work over the last 8 months. And a special thanks to our working groups and their leaders, to the Safety Working Group for providing much needed recommendations on commercial human spaceflight, and for helping AST prepare for whatever the future regulatory framework holds. To the Regulatory Working Group for your work on a way forward for Part 440, and to the Innovation Infrastructure Working Group for tackling spaceport grant funding, for looking at electronic licensing, and most importantly, taking a look at a national spaceport construct. Having been at Cape Canaveral, I know this is a passionate and sometimes emotional topic, but one we need to think through. And we need to have these discussions before we run out of capacity, not after. So to Paul Damphus, the new cat herder, the I&I working group, and really to everyone on COMSTAC, thank you for working on this, even though I know it was at times a topic that drove vigorous discussion. This is a phenomenal group of industry leaders, and again, we cannot thank you enough for your time and efforts. And finally, a big thanks to Jim Hatton and our team for hosting this event, and also to Randy Repchak, Charles Hewitt, Steph Earle, and Pam Underwood for your updates today. But again, thank you to everybody. And I look forward to working on these really tough topics with you as we continue to move forward. Thanks again. Jim, back over to you.
All right, thank you, sir. And if everybody else had a bit of garbled on Wayne's message, I'll sum it up in just a few quick words. He thanked everybody, and he may be a rocket scientist, but sometimes audio gets the best of all of us. So thank you, sir, for your comments. I think we got most of it anyway. Again, thank you so much. I do want to express my thanks to everybody on COMSTAC. I've been there for just about every meeting, and you all have put in an enormous amount of work. And I will tell you that your recommendations are taken very seriously. The department was listening in today. I know a lot of people were tuned in, and once I get the information on how many people were tuned in, I will pass it on to you all. But as you heard the administrator speak this morning, and then Wayne Monteith speak also, your recommendations, observations, and especially your advice is taken very seriously and being acted on. So AST is moving out on the things that you have identified, recommendations you've made, and it is very valuable because you see a part of this industry that we as a regulator side don't necessarily see and don't necessarily think about. So what you come up with is critical to us being your good government partner in this industry. Again, thank you to Charity and Karina for leading this whole group and for all the work that each of you have put in. Greatly appreciated for every work group chair and vice chair and all the additional support people out there that supported the principals who are on COMSTAC. Everyone is done an absolutely outstanding job, and although there was a lot of debate and discussion, it was well worth it, and it's been a learning environment for everyone. So I greatly appreciate it. I will say thank you and give back a good bit of your time. Charity, was there any last word from you?
Yes. Happy Friday, TGIF, everyone.
All right. Thank you. And like I mentioned before, the next COMSTAC meeting will be on the 15th of March, 2022. All things being wonderful, it'll be here in Washington, D.C., but virus does get a vote, and we hope that we have that completely under control. I wish everybody here and on YouTube safety. And if you're traveling between now and the end of the holiday season and the next COMSTAC, please be safe, be careful, and take care of one another. And we will see you in March, if not before. And with that, COMSTAC is adjourned. Thank you.